This interview is being tape recorded. I am Detective Constable 842 Shakespeare of the Essex Police stationed at the Central Detective Unit at Police Headquarters. We're at an interview room at Colchester Police Station. The time on my watch is now 21 hours and it's Friday the 17th of the 5th, 96. We are here to interview Michael John Steele. If you could just introduce yourself, Mr. Steele, to the tape, please. Michael John Steele, Oaklands, Anglers Green, Colchester. My date of birth is the 13th of the 1242. There is another officer present, Philip Norton, Detective Constable. Thank you. I just remind Mr. Steele, as you're fully aware, that you're under caution whereby you do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something that you later rely on in court, and anything you do say may be given in evidence. I'd like to point out to you that your legal representation, of course, is present in the interview room, and I'll ask him to introduce himself in one moment. I'd also like to point out that you are entitled to free independent legal advice at any stage, and anything you're not happy with, anything you want to discuss at any stage in this interview, you are perfectly entitled to ask us to stop the interview so that you can have a chance for a private consultation with your solicitor. Okay, also present in the room is your solicitor. Thank you very much, DC Shakespeare. I'm Christopher Bowen, a solicitor with Jeeps & Son based here in Colchester. I'm now required to explain my role once again at this interview is to advise my client and to look after his basic legal rights. I confirm that we've had a briefing, not based on the original briefing note that I've received, but nevertheless we've had a brief briefing. The original single-page briefing sheet, as I've said, doesn't cover the matters to be discussed at this interview. It appears from the briefing that I've received from DC Shakespeare and DC Norton, that's the importation alleged to have taken place. That's the importation of controlled drugs between the 25th of the 3rd, 96 and the 16th of the 4th, 96 is not supported by any evidence. I've requested further information and any evidence for the allegation, but this hasn't been forthcoming. I do understand that the officers in the room are taking instructions from the officers more senior of them. Again, I wish that the senior officers would be prepared to give us more disclosure. Again, I invite the officer to consider further disclosures so I can take further instructions from my client. There is apparently a tape recording of an undercover police officer with someone called Mickey relevant to this interview. I would have liked to have listened to the tape recording before this interview. I understand it can only be listened in the interview situation. Before we've come in, I've asked if we could listen to it, and I know officers that you've been told by your senior officer that the tape recording can only be played if we can guarantee in advance of the tape recording being played that my client is going to make a comment. Unfortunately, my position on this is very clear. I'm unable to inform you prior to listening to the tape recording myself as to whether my client would be prepared to make any comment or not. I simply cannot take his instructions at this point on matters that I have not heard. This is another example of the lack of disclosure by the police investigating these extremely serious offences. When the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 came into force, the police received an advantage not previously at their disposal. Section 34 of the Act meant that a court may draw interference from a defendant's silence. That Act says such interferences may be drawn from the failure as appear proper. In order for an advance interference to be drawn against my client, one of the material issues has to be the level of police disclosure. My client is in police custody for some of the most serious offences imaginable. Matters to be discussed at this interview were not, as I've already said, mentioned on the original briefing sheet. Information given to me by the police suggests that the police have information regarding an importation of cannabis. No evidence, as I've said, has been produced to justify this. As a result, as far as I'm concerned, Mr. Steele's solicitor, I'm unable properly to assess the strength of the police evidence. Effectively, I'm having to work with my hands tied behind my back without an ability to consider evidence in detail. Again, as in previous interviews, I can only advise my client to exercise his right of silence. At present, no information is available regarding the content of the telephone call. I would like to listen to the content of that tape. I would like to listen to the content of that tape recording because at present I have no understanding as to the relevance of this information to the current offences which you wish to discuss. It may assist us if the tape is to be played. I invite you at this point to consider allowing us to have the tape played at this interview. We would like to hear it, then after we've been able to listen to it, I will be able to take further instructions from my client. If the case is I'm not able to listen to it, given that I cannot give assurances in advance of listening to it, my client will definitely comment. I cannot possibly give any guarantees. Finally, during all consultations with the police, I feel I've been deliberately left in the dark regarding the vast amount of evidence the police claim to have. To date, none of the 300 odd statements that I've been told are in existence on 2 databases have been shown to me. I can only surmise the reason for this. Once again, this is very late in the 3-day laydown my client has had to go through. I invite the police to make full disclosure to the defence of all the evidence which is relevant for me to advise my client properly. Now I've given that particular information at several other interviews. I mean the words I say. I invite the police to give the defence full disclosure. At the present time, I have no disclosure whatsoever to speak from, apart from a couple of paragraphs regarding allegations. That's all I have. I cannot advise my client to do anything other than to exercise his right to silence. Thank you very much for your great patience that you've had with me during today and all the other days that we've had. You've allowed me without interruption to give my legal advice on tape. I'm grateful, and now I'm going to let you begin the interview. Please, DC Shakespeare, I may allow you to continue now, but please respect my client's decision to remain silent. Obviously, just in relation to that statement that you've made that I must just reply, and I must say for the benefit of the tape that the following applies. We have given what we consider to be the fullest appropriate information at this stage, and we now wish to give the client the opportunity of giving his account of the incident. Mr. Steele, I'd like to ask you questions now, not immediately in relation to the immediate importation that I arrested you for at the end of the last interview. We're just covering 1 or 2 points over matters that we've covered in our previous interviews, if I may. First of all, in the previous interview, I was talking to you about a trip that Darren Nichols says that he made with you. He says in the summer or the autumn time of 1995 last year. If you recall, and I remind you that Darren Nichols tells us that he travelled for the day to Holland, he says with you, is there anything you'd like to tell me about the alleged day trip to Holland in company with Darren Nichols? Mr. Steele, we again haven't been given any evidence about this. Look at any statements or transcripts of interviews. I can only say to you at this point, as your legal advisor, I advise you to remain silent. Just to refresh your memory, Mr. Steele, that Darren Nichols tells us that at the time, on the day trip to Holland, he had a Golf convertible motor vehicle. Whether or not that may ring any bells with you, I don't know. And he tells us that on the day in question, you travelled over to Holland with a man by the name of Peter, who we obviously say is an associate of yours, Peter Corey, a name we've obviously heard in previous interviews. Just to remind you that Darren Nichols says that you went to Stone's Cafe in Amsterdam, which is a cafe owned by the Stones brothers, and that you had a meeting on that day in question with a man by the name of John Stone. Can you tell me what the purposes of that meeting was in Amsterdam on that day? Can you tell me whether you know a man by the name of John Stone, or indeed whether you know the premises by the name of Stone's Cafe in Amsterdam? He says, Darren Nichols, that is, that you travelled to Amsterdam via the Channel Tunnel, where following this meeting you returned later that day on a lengthy trip, but it was completed, he says, over a day's sort of period. Is there any legitimate reason, Mr. Steele, you can tell me why you travelled over to Amsterdam on that occasion with Mr. Nichols? Obviously, we say to you that we think the reason that you went to Amsterdam on that occasion was to perhaps to arrange a subsequent importation, which that in fact was the case. I'll then go on to remind you about a matter that we discussed in the previous interview that again, based upon what Darren Nichols has told us, if you remember, he said that about a month after he went on that trip with you, he spoke to you and you asked him to deliver the sum of £80,000 in cash over to Amsterdam as payment for a consignment. Darren Nichols tells us that you paid him £2,000 or offered to pay him £2,000 for the trip. Is there any comment you'd like to make with regard to the allegation? Darren Nichols tells us that he travelled to the continent in company with Peter, taking out the sum of £80,000 he said that was given to him in a holdall. He tells us that in Amsterdam, there was a meeting between Peter and again this John Stone man, who we say is obviously your contact over in Amsterdam, or one of your contacts anyway. Darren Nichols then tells us that he was responsible to hire a car out of Amsterdam and that the cannabis, which was on this occasion was grass, was put in the boot of the vehicle, where he then drove it in the company with Peter to Ostend, where he says the drugs were placed onto a beach. Have you any knowledge at all about what Darren Nichols is saying with regard to that matter? Is there any comment that you would like to make to us regard to that allegation that you was involved in that matter? Sorry, officer, Mr. Steele, this information that is not backed up by evidence as far as I can see at the moment. Obviously, you're aware I'm acting in the dark somewhat. I can only say to you that you should remain silent because there's no evidence on which I can properly advise you as to whether you should answer that particular question. Thank you, DC Shakespeare. Darren Nichols then is, he says, waiting on the beach or near the beach in Ostend when he says he hears the noise of a boat. It's obviously dark, it's late at night, but that Peter is in possession of a two-way radio, he says, and that there's some sort of a call signal that's going on this two-way radio. But he tells us that as far as he is concerned, it was his voice. Sorry, your voice that he heard on the radio as this boat comes in towards the shore and obviously we say makes the collection of the drugs, which is then put into the boat and the boat moves away from the beach. Was that you in that particular boat on that particular occasion, Mr. Steele? Is it the case that you travelled out from this country in a boat, whether it be a rib inflatable dinghy that we've heard about on previous interviews, or perhaps another boat that you have access to? Is there any comment you would like to make about this allegation about your involvement in that particular matter? Darren Nichols tells us when he returned to the UK subsequent to that particular incident that you paid him not the money that was promised but a kilo of the herbal cannabis. Mr. Steele, we've mentioned in previous interviews about payments made with the use of your Barclaycard. If you remember, we asked the questions in relation to a bill that was paid at the Burlington Hotel in Ostend by the use of that Barclaycard. Our inquiries have shown us that that Barclaycard was used on the 6th of the 12th, 95 to pay the sum of £206.95 to Transair. I asked you before to indicate who has access to your Barclaycard, and I will specifically ask you on this occasion the sum of £206.95 to Transair on the 6th of the 12th, 95. What does that relate to that particular transaction? Could you help me out? On the 20th of the 12th, 95, your Barclaycard was used to pay a further bill of £206.95 to the same company or business or whatever it may be, Transair. Can you help me out with any information about that particular transaction, Mr. Steele, on the 20th of the 12th, 95? Well, both of these transactions that I've mentioned are legitimate transactions for something that you bought or paid for in connection with a business, your business, holiday, anything. Is there anything that you can tell us to help us out with our inquiries to prove or disprove the legitimacy of that particular transaction? Mr. Steele, it is the police's job to work out what's legitimate or illegitimate, so I would advise you not to answer that question. Moving on to the 5th of the 1st, 96, our inquiries have revealed that you were seen at the Clacton Launch Slip car park in the Hilux, where your headlamps were facing out to sea for 15 minutes. They were turned off for 10 minutes and then back on for 15 minutes. Can you recall anything about that particular incident? I'm very sorry, I missed the date in January. Sorry, the 5th of the 1st, 96. Thank you. At 1900 hours, on the 5th of the 1st, 96, your vehicle was seen outside the Flag Public House. Is that a public house that you frequent on a regular basis? On the 7th of the 1st, 96, we understand that there was a burglary that was committed at Meadow Cottage, London Road, Clacton, a property that we already know is yours and that you in fact reported the burglary, I believe, on the 9th of the 1st, 96. Do you have any ideas of who may have committed the burglary? Have you any idea to whether it's connected in any way to any allegations that have been put to you? Mr. Steele, I can see no relevance between a burglary at your property and a drug consignment at the present time. I'd advise you not to answer that question. On the 25th of the 1st, 96, Mr. Steele, you were seen at the premises known as AJ's Restaurant, which is located on the A12 on the Ipswich Road at Dedham. Whilst you were inside that premises, you were seen to be with another male, and whilst you were there, you took a telephone call from Peter. During the course of the conversation, you allegedly said that you would pick it up and that you'd be home in 30 minutes. You then left the premises, the second man then driving off in a motor vehicle. Can you recall that particular meeting in AJ's Restaurant? On the 1st of the 3rd, 96, our inquiries show us that yourself, a man by the name of David Gwennett, who we believe to be Paul Gwennett, which is a name which I'm not sure whether was mentioned to you in previous interviews. Certainly your solicitor is aware of that name. I can confirm I am, thank you. And a man by the name of Jack Williams, who we've heard mentioned on a number of occasions, returned to the United Kingdom on a ferry from Holland via Felixstowe that you collected in a motor vehicle. Can you tell me what your relationship is with a man by the name of Paul Gwennett, who I have to say is also in custody in relation to this incident? I've asked you specifically in relation to this alleged importation that occurred between the 25th of the 3rd, 96 and the 16th of the 4th. The conspiracy side of it. Featured in that alleged conspiracy is Russell Tate, who we already know is the brother of Patrick Tate, the man who we say was murdered by you and Jack Williams on the 6th of the 12th, 95. Russell Tate owns a Mercedes, a black Mercedes motor vehicle, and on the 26th of the 3rd, 96, at 8:40 in the morning, Russell Tate was seen at the mobile services at Boreham Interchange putting petrol into the motor vehicle. At 9:02 on the same morning, Russell Tate was seen to leave the McDonald's restaurant at Boreham Interchange and was having a conversation with you, Mr. Steele, before he left. That's the 26th of the 3rd. What was that conversation about? What was that meeting about? As he drives off, that is Russell Tate from the McDonald's, a Granada motor vehicle pulls up and a man by the name of Craig Androlakis gets into the Mercedes with Russell Tate. Now there's a name that we haven't heard mentioned before, and I have to tell you that Androlakis is also in custody in relation to these matters. Could you tell me what your relationship is with Craig Androlakis? How do you know him? Can I ask a question? Sorry, very sorry. I'm just slightly behind on what you were saying. As Russell Tate drove off, a Granada pulled up, is that right? And then the person at Androlakis, he got into whose vehicle, please? Tate's. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you. No problem. It needs some clarity because the way that's come out is the fact that the motor's moved off and he's got into it after it's moved off, which obviously can't be correct. Well, it moved off the drive area, then stopped. Androlakis then got in and drove away. I'm not trying to infer that anybody went into the vehicle as it was moving away. No, but you. At 19:33, that same morning, the 26th of the 3rd, the Mercedes containing Russell Tate and Androlakis arrived at the Watermill Public House in Basildon. Androlakis is seen sitting on a beach outside the Windmill Public House, and at the same time, Russell Tate and another person by the name of James arrive, and they go into the Watermill Public House. Subsequently, a few minutes later, Russell Tate, Androlakis and a man by the name of James goes to the boot of the Mercedes and there is an exchange that takes place. Other people are then involved and white packets were exchanged and the vehicles subsequently leave the Watermill Public House. This is important because at 10:40 that morning the vehicles are stopped on the A13 at Lakeside and it is found that Russell Tate was in possession of £21,000 worth of Bank of England used notes and about £750 in Spanish pesetas. Another person was found to be in possession of £1,000. A further £20,000 was found on the floor of the Mercedes. A further £8,800 was in Tate's suitcase in the Mercedes, and a sum of £1,000 was on the door of the Rover. We obviously say to you that these people were conveying money to the continent on behalf of yourself and others. Were you aware of that incident on the 26th of the 3rd, 96, Mr. Steele? Who was driving the Rover? I only heard one mention of a Rover right at the end. Or was it just, I can't confirm that. Can't confirm that. Okay, thanks. All these people were arrested and spent some time in police custody, but they were eventually all released without charge. And then on the 27th of the 3rd, the very next day, our inquiries show that Russell Tate, Androlakis and some of the others left the UK via Dover in the black Mercedes and also the Rover motor vehicle from the day before. This, we say, is the start of the background into pursuing the drugs on the continent, and we say, Mr. Steele, that you have full knowledge of what was going on. We find that our inquiries show that Russell Tate spent a little time in France, then he moved on to Spain, to Gibraltar, back to Spain, back to France, onto Belgium, and in that period of time then takes us up to the period of around about the 13th of the 4th, 96, when you booked a lunchtime meal at the Harbour Lights restaurant Tishmas Marina at Walton. Can you tell me on the 13th of the 4th, 96, who you went to lunch with at the Tishmas Marina? At about 1300 hours on the 14th of the 4th, 96, your blue Toyota was seen to arrive at the premises of GT Commercials at Barham. We say that this is the time for the preparation of a run to the continent to collect the drugs involved in this particular importation. Did you travel to GT Commercials Barham at 1 o'clock on the 14th of the 4th, Mr. Steele? If you did, why did you go there? If you didn't go there, would you like to tell us? At about 1400 hours on the 14th of the 4th, the rib boat that we've described being used in this previous importation is seen to be removed from the workshop at GT Commercials and hitched onto the motor vehicle, blue transit van, which I think we've mentioned before in previous interviews. That vehicle is seen to pull off towing the trailer Jack Worms is driving and there's another person in the vehicle. Was that person you, Mr. Steele, in the vehicle on that occasion with Jack Worms? The vehicle is then seen at the Tesco's petrol station on the A14 at Copdock, where Jack Worms fills up the rib with £150 of petrol. Shortly afterwards, at 2:45 on the 14th of the 4th, the rib goes into the entrance at Leventon Marina being towed, and that short while later, towing the empty trailer dripping water leaves the marina. Obviously, you don't have to be an expert to say that the rib, we say, was placed in the water at that time. If you were the other man that was in that vehicle at the marina, did you drive the rib boat out of the marina and head out to sea? Is there any information that you can give us as to the activities on that day? And could you tell us who else may have had access to the use of your rib boat? At about 9:45 in the morning of the 14th of the 4th, the man, Angela Cass, was seen at Dover in a motor vehicle returning from Calais. A check of that vehicle showed that there was a set of fisherman's waders boots and there was a map of the Benelux countries. There was a hire agreement for the car in the name of Darren Nichols, and that a check of the car shows traces of salt water and sand. Was that perhaps the vehicle that was used to transport the consignment of any drugs down to a beach area where it was laid up, we say, for you to collect? There was a number of phone calls throughout the 14th of the 4th, 96, Mr. Steele, between all of the main parties in this conspiracy. I don't intend at this stage to go through them because it's going to take an awfully long time. But suffice to say, there was numerous phone calls that were made. I've asked you in previous interviews whether you could help me as to your recollection of any calls made to the other people that we've heard mentioned during the course of these interviews. What your contact is with them, the reason why you phone them, whether you operate an illegitimate sort of business with them, and again, I will ask you the same questions in relation to this particular matter. At 22:45 hours on the 14th of the 4th, the rib boat is seen at Brighton-on-Sea, hard placed on a trailer. The trailer still displaying the index number. The trailer on this occasion is being towed by a blue Range Rover, which we understand is a vehicle that Mr. Worms has access to. 3 male persons were seen present, 2 of whom were wearing what's described as wet weather gear. Are you one of these men near the rib boat on that occasion? We obviously say that on that occasion we believe a consignment of controlled drugs is brought into the country. Would you like to tell us now your involvement in that particular matter? Would you like to give us a location of any drugs to your knowledge that were brought into this country as a result of that particular importation? On the 15th of the 4th, 96 at 18:32 hours, you were seen in a little chef on the A12 at Riverhall on the Colchester bound carriageway. Shortly afterwards, there was a Granada motor vehicle which was driven by Peter Corey driving away from that location. There was also a Sierra motor vehicle seen to leave that location as well. For the benefit of the tape, I'd just like to say that I sat very close to you in the little chef of the A112 at Colchester that day, and that you are the man that I saw in company with Russell Tate and a third man sitting on a bench at the end of the restaurant, and that about 18:56 hours you left the little chef, you and Russell Tate got into the Hilux in the car park. After a short while, Russell Tate got out of the vehicle and he walked away, and then you drove off on the A112 Colchester bound. Can you tell me now what the purposes of that meeting was between you and Russell Tate, that meeting we say the day after that consignment of controlled, we say, was brought into the country? That forms the substance of the allegation concerning the alleged conspiracy to import controlled drugs between the 25th of the 3rd 96 and the 16th of the 4th 96. And obviously, I'd just like to point out to you, Mr. Steele, that the events of that day follow very closely the events of the importation that occurred this previous weekend just gone. The rib goes into the water, comes back, drugs are taken onto the shore, and a team of people who we say obviously is masterminded by you is involved then in the collection and distribution of the same. Leaving that matter to one side, because you've obviously not going to make any comment to me about that, we'd just like to ask you in relation to the shotgun that was found at Meadow Cottage during the search which we mentioned to you in a previous interview. I just wonder whether you could confirm for the benefit of the tape as to whether you hold any sort of firearms license, shotgun license, and to whether there is any legitimate explanation that you could give to me as to why you should be in possession of that weapon, which of course is a prohibited weapon under the Firearms Act. Is there any information that you can give to me as to how that particular weapon ended up in your loft under the floorboards? If the gun doesn't belong to you, could you tell me who it does belong to? If it was the case that you were looking after the weapon for somebody, would you just like to tell me who that person was and what the circumstances were of that weapon actually being in your premises? We understand from Darren Nichols that you had a bonfire around your house at Meadow Cottage. Could you please tell me what the circumstances were with regard to who you invited to that bonfire night? Did you dispose of any items concerned with the murder, whether it be clothing, weapons, in order to invade any forensic evidence that may connect you with the murders? On the 18th of the 4th 96, Darren Nichols tells us that he was working near to Gallows Corner, Romford, when he had a meeting with you, and that you gave him a kilo of cannabis, which consisted of 4 soap bars. When you handed that cannabis to Darren Nichols, were you in company of Paul Gwinnett? Could you tell me the purposes as to why you gave that drug to Darren Nichols at that time? Were you actually involved in that particular exchange of controlled drugs, Mr. Steele? Darren Nichols has also told me that a month before the murders, or about a month before the murders of Pat Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe, that you asked or told Darren Nichols that you wanted to purchase a shotgun. Darren Nichols tells us that he contacted somebody that he knows, and sometime later, in fact, it was following the deaths of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe that Darren Nichols obtained a shotgun on your behalf. He says that he phoned you in a bit of a state of panic because he didn't know what to do with it in regard to the weapon that had been provided to him. And he says that you told him to the words to the effect, "We'll buy it because we don't want to arouse any suspicion." Darren Nichols tells us that he purchased the shotgun on your behalf for the sum of £350 and that he then handed the shotgun to you. It was a pump-action shotgun, he says, contained in a brown case. Did that particular transaction occur, Mr. Steele? Did you ask Darren Nichols to purchase a shotgun on your behalf? And in fact, a shotgun that he refers to is the same shotgun that was evidently recovered from Meadow Cottage. I intend to conclude the interview fairly shortly now. You've maintained your right to silence throughout the interview, obviously based upon your own feelings and the advice from your solicitor. Before we conclude the interview, just want to ask you one final time, now that you've had time to consider all the matters that have been put to you, as to whether you would like to make any comment to us about the matters that we've discussed. I would also like to put it to you for the final time that on the 16th of the 12th, Mr. Steele, it is alleged that you were involved in the murders of Patrick Tate, Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. Were you involved in those murders, Mr. Steele? Did you shoot them in the company with Jack Wombs? Have you ever, Mr. Steele, been involved in any conspiracies to import any controlled drugs from the continent into this country? A shotgun, pump-action shotgun, has been found at your premises at Meadow Cottage. Why do you have that gun in your possession? Who does it belong to? Does it not belong to you? Okay, I intend to therefore conclude the interview. It is still Friday the 17th of the 5th, 96, and the time by my watch now is 21:44 hours.